So I'm talking today with Philipa McCormack. Philipa is a PhD candidate and sessional lecturer at the Faculty of Law at the University of Tasmania. Philipa, your recent work looks at how environmental plans around Australia deal with the impact of climate change on biodiversity. So Philipa, first, what is biodiversity and why is climate change a problem for biodiversity that everybody should care about?
So when we talk about biodiversity, we're talking about the diversity of all life on Earth. So genetic diversity and the diversity of species and ecosystems. And they're important in their own right. Their right to exist, they are beautiful, they also sustain life on Earth. So the interactions between different species that make up these systems provide services for humans, pollination, crops, water cycling, some climate control, but they also sustain everything else. They're all interconnected, and one of the major implications of climate change is that those connections are going to change and are already changing. We know that temperatures are increasing, sea levels are rising, where rain falls and how much falls is changing. So those combinations of temperature and rainfall that make the sweet spot for any particular species, their habitat where they survive, those places are going to lose that connection and species are shifting, but not at the same rate. So there are huge implications for people and for other systems. Coastal communities that rely on fish stocks to survive, if those fish stocks shift, those coastal communities can't necessarily just follow the fish, they lose their subsistence lifestyle. And that's sort of playing out across plant and animal and ecosystems across the world. So huge implications.
So you've actually, in some of your recent writing, talked about human-induced climate change as a wicked problem, both for the Earth system and for environmental law and policy. So looking at Australia, are Australian laws on conservation actually equipped to help us deal with this wicked problem?
Yes and no. Like any good research project, the answer is yes and no. And it's partly because of those combinations of changes that we're seeing. So we have, for example, in our legal framework, we have a network of protected areas, and we have laws that support the expansion of our protected area estate. One of the challenges is that they focus on what was in a particular location at a particular time rather than what might be there in the future, or the sort of diversity and function of those areas. So one of the challenges that we're going to see is that some research sort of released a few years ago demonstrated that we're likely to have the same level of diversity in each individual or in our sort of protected area estate that we have had in the past. What makes up that diversity is going to change really dramatically. So when protected area agencies and managers are told you have to maintain biodiversity or conserve biodiversity within the protected area, the way we've interpreted that is protect what you've got, keep it there, keep it the same, and that isn't going to be possible. And attempts to do that may actually be really problematic for conserving biodiversity in the future. Similarly, we've got sort of threatened species laws that prioritise intervention and conservation action depending on how close something is to extinction. The effort to protect and keep the tools in the toolbox, if you like, as many species as we can is not a bad goal at all, but to focus on the most threatened at any one time and then filter that again by charisma in many cases, or the information that we have. So we know a lot about this species, we know it's really at risk, but we don't know much about these. They may be equally at risk. We focus a lot on mammals, not so much on invertebrates and soil microbes, which underpin those systems that keep everything functioning. So we have laws for protecting things, but the focus of those laws for the most part is going to be really challenged as the climate changes.
So when people talk about climate justice, they often mention ideas like having more participation in the processes of making regulations or rights for nature or future generations. So, what are some of the challenges with these ideas if you're thinking about conservation and regulation?
As a starting point, I think it's probably worth pointing out that those ideas are very useful in some ways, but yeah, the concept of climate change really might challenge some of those. So for example, the rights of nature idea, to somehow build into our system of laws and policies and practice the idea that natural systems, river systems, desert ecosystems should have the right to continue to exist without the intervention or without the harm being caused to them by human actions, is a really valuable one. From a legal perspective, some of the really significant challenges include who represents those rights. So in a practical way, a person has to speak for those rights, for those entities, and determining who those people are can sometimes be really challenging. And I think there's the example of sort of the New Zealand legislation for the Wanganui River, and there's also an area that was formerly a national park and is now a legal person. Within those legislative frameworks, the New Zealand approach has been to establish guardians, basically, of those river systems. So there's a clear process for identifying who might bring legal action to defend the rights of that river to continue to flow and to flourish, and funding arrangements. And who's going to pay for these rights to be protected is a really big challenge. By comparison, there was a case in India not that long ago which declared legal personhood for glaciers and rivers, and in particular the Ganges River. And it was almost an act of desperation. We haven't been able to control pollution and sort of the use of that river, and so we're going to declare it a legal person. But from a really practical perspective, enforcing that, protecting that river, acting on behalf of that river, funding action, the multitude of sort of development and economic and social issues that sort of surround that process were not fleshed out. And of course, a court doesn't have the power to set up a funding body to act on behalf of that system. So there's some really significant challenges, but I think it's really important. It reminds us that humans aren't the only actors on this planet, and we are arriving at a state where desperation probably needs to drive us a little bit, I think, in the way that we conserve biodiversity.
And are there any good models out there in terms of expanding participation in the process of conserving nature?
I think that's an ongoing challenge as well. Who gets to have a say? How long do you provide? Who funds the sort of appropriate levels of engagement? Look, I think that a lot of the time, the effort is there, but one of the big challenges for that, other people can speak probably to the challenges that we have at the moment, but in terms of climate change, one of the really big issues is, as things change quite suddenly in some cases, acting to intervene and conserve a species from extinction, or prop up an ecosystem that's unravelling that we're really relying on, we're sometimes not going to have the weeks or months to engage effectively with every stakeholder that really has a significant stake in the outcome. And I think that one of the big shifts that really has to happen is a much more proactive approach to engagement that almost sets up an ongoing kind of engagement process to say, well, what are the strategic outcomes that we're seeking here? What are some of the ways we might achieve that? If this happens, what then? If this happens, what then? Who? And have that engagement process well in advance of any unravelling and we can't be in advance of extinctions. I mean, we're way past that now, but I think that we need to be much more proactive and much more strategic about that engagement process, because doing it when the decision needs to be made is way too late.
So given, as I said before, you've described this as a wicked problem, are there any hopeful signs or good news stories out there? What do you think's working, or what could work?
I'm swamped by the sad stories and the enormity of these challenges, but there are some good news stories. The dramatic increase in the number and size of Indigenous protected areas that have been incorporated into our reserve estate over the last few years is amazing, and has some really positive implications for Indigenous communities in terms of employment and well-being and connection to country, which is so significant. But also obviously for conservation, for the primary sort of process of managing these areas to conserve biodiversity. And I think that that's a really positive development. And another positive development is sort of a shift in Australia, an improvement, I guess, in our private protected area estate. So we have some really big players like the Wildlife Conservancy and in Tasmania, the Tasmanian Land Conservancy, protecting really large areas of land as private protected areas and engaging with farmers to set aside some areas on their farms and really manage those to conserve biodiversity. And that's really encouraging and really important. I think the future of conservation is really in that private space because government just doesn't have the money to protect everything that we need to protect. But what we really need to see, I think one of the really big things we need to see is a shift towards more people, not just farmers, not just large conservation NGOs, but everyone having a sense of the importance of nature, of a backyard that's teeming with life, you know, of the contribution that everybody makes to protecting the places we have, creating the places we need, facilitating the conservation and the movement and the interactions that sustains biodiversity and life on this planet.
Thank you, that's great.
I did an accidental rap then.
You did. No, I wanted you to do it, so that was great. That's exactly what I needed, so thank you. Awesome.